Hey, check out this 110-year-old postcard I got. Cradle Rock in Barre, Massachusetts. One boulder perfectly and precariously perched upon another boulder. Pretty cool looking, right? Well, guess what? It looks even cooler in person. Cradle Rock in about 1909 and Cradle Rock in 2022. Real amazing little natural feature, isn't it? Two big hunks of granite, looking like they could tumble over the edge of the hill at a moment's notice. But they won't. Those two big boulders are locked together like steel. But were they always? Well, it depends on what you read. You see, as I was looking into the history of Cradle Rock here, I uncovered a very minor, very low stakes, and all around mostly inconsequential war of information fought throughout decades and decades of writing on Cradle Rock. Most of the people involved probably never even knew the war was going on, and to be honest, even those that did probably didn't worry about it all that much. Except for two guys who really cared. But we'll get back to them later. The disagreement actually starts with just the name, Cradle Rock. You see, this stone isn't always called that. There's another name for it that's been thrown around in history basically just as much. The Barre, Massachusetts Rocking Stone. A name which implies something very specific. You see, there are rocking stones or tipping rocks all across New England. Just to name a few that I know about, there is, or at least were, rocking stones in Goshen, Connecticut, Lanesboro, Massachusetts, Groton, Connecticut, Fall River, Massachusetts, Gloucester, Massachusetts, Hanover, New Hampshire, Dover, New Hampshire. You get the idea, right? They're all over. And I'll probably end up making videos about a bunch of them at some point in the future, right? But what actually are they? Well, as the name implies, a tipping rock or rocking stone is a massive boulder that can be moved by a human without too much trouble. Usually because they're, sitting on top of another rock at a weird angle, or they're partially stuck in a hole or something like that. The vast majority of them are glacial boulders, which is also what Cradle Rock is, by the way. All that means is that at one point they were picked up by a large glacier, carried around for a while, sometimes hundreds of miles, and then eventually dumped somewhere new as the glacier melted or moved away. So in Cradle Rock's case here, just by pure happenstance, the two boulders were dropped off sitting right on top of each other like that. But anyway, the question is, does Cradle Rock rock? Well, nowadays, the answer is a pretty objective no. There's no way that one person is going to be able to move that stone on top there. And there's not much modern disagreement on that either. Every reference to Cradle Rock that you'll find in the last 60, 70 years or so will never try to say that that's a rocking stone. But you start to go back further in time, and that changes. For example, back in 1921, the classic travel and natural science book, The Strange Adventures of a Pebble, briefly mentioned Cradle Rock, saying in the town of Barre is a big boulder with a small boulder on its back. The small boulder can be set rocking like a hobby horse. And here's another one, this time in a 1903 issue of the Epworth Herald, a newspaper that used to run in Chicago. There's an article in here that's about rocking stones all across the world, and again, Barre stone is mentioned with that same rocking horse metaphor. But around the same time period, there's plenty of sources that say the opposite too, that Cradle Rock doesn't rock. Like this article in the Boston Globe from 1902. The article is very clear that the rock doesn't move at all, but does mention that maybe it might have rocked at some point in the past. This actually comes up a lot. Even in a lot of the sources that say, oh, Cradle Rock definitely doesn't rock anymore, they might throw in, just as an aside, oh, but according to tradition, it did rock at some point in the past. Usually that's accompanied with some kind of like crazy story about how the rock stopped rocking. It's usually something like a farmer got mad that people were trespassing on his land to see the rock, or maybe he was afraid that the rock was going to fall over and hurt somebody. There's even one really crazy story I read that says that a bunch of Puritans thought that the rock must have been like a literal baby's cradle for a species of giant that lived before the Noah's Ark flood, and so they wanted to destroy it because it was a heretical artifact of the past, right? But whatever the particulars or motivations in the story, the method for moving it is always that a bunch of oxen were strapped to it and used to pull it into a locked place. Remember that for later. It's going to be important. But back to the central question, though. Did Cradle Rock ever rock? Well, one thing you'll notice when you read through all the sources that call Cradle Rock an active rocking stone is that they are pretty much never firsthand. I didn't find any accounts of anyone being like, oh yeah, I went to Cradle Rock and rocked it myself. And honestly, the vast majority of the stuff saying that it rocked is pretty much just like quick references as a part of a larger story. Never anything comprehensive. Just asides, like, oh, there's a rocking stone in Barre. Oh, Barre's got a rocking stone too. Like, remember that article on rocking stones from the Chicago newspaper that we talked about? Do you think they really went all the way to Barre, Massachusetts from Chicago to check for themselves that the stone still rocks? Just for those couple of lines they threw in? Probably not, right? But then on the flip side, we've got accounts from people who are very familiar with the stone and very clear that it doesn't move. Like this book, Picturesque Worcester from 1895. An outline of the towns of Worcester County, Massachusetts, and the interesting and beautiful places you can find throughout them. It's written by a couple guys who are from around here, and it's just full of detailed and passionate descriptions of all sorts of landmarks. On Cradle Rock, they are quite clear. Situated in a pasture, a little distance from town, are two immense stones, together making a height of about 20 feet. One rests lightly upon the other in such a position that apparently a strong wind or push would roll it to the ground below. But on the contrary, it is so firmly poised that most strenuous efforts have failed to remove it. And then we can go back even further than that, to George Bryant Woods, a soldier, writer, historian, and most importantly, a native of Barre, Massachusetts. He wrote in 1867 that old traditional folklore states that Cradle Rock used to move, but also makes it quite clear that as long as he has known of it, it hasn't rocked. Considering that George was born in Barre in 1844, years and years before almost every mention I found of Cradle Rock being an active rocking stone, that is pretty powerful, right? Plus, George's dad is actually from around here too, and he was born back in 1819. So you would think that if he or anybody else that George knew had been around when the stone was still rocking, that George probably would have mentioned that, right? It wouldn't just be a legend, it would be something that a relative or neighbor actually saw themselves. That's pretty solid evidence, to me at least, that Cradle Rock probably wasn't rocking for most of the 1800s. The only piece of counter evidence I found that kind of gums that up is an account by the geologist Edward Hitchcock. Back in 1840, he wrote a little bit about rocking stones and mentions Barre stone as one example. He even includes a little sketch. The sketch does make me think that he probably did visit the stone personally, although it is possible that he drew this based off of other drawings or descriptions of the stone. Like, it is a little weird that he drew the ground flat like that when one of the main features of the rock is that it's teetering on a slope. But even then, if he did visit it himself in person, he still never says that he rocked the stone or describes how it rocks or anything like that. It's totally possible that he just heard it was a rocking stone, visited it, sketched it, maybe tried to rock it himself, but just assumed that he couldn't do it because he didn't know the right angle or he wasn't strong enough, or maybe he just couldn't reach the stone on top because it's pretty high up there, right? And he just wrote down that it was a rocking stone and went on his way. In addition to that, from the George Bryant Woods letter, we know for sure that the stone didn't rock in at least 1867, right? So if the stone rocked when Hitchcock mentioned it in 1840, is it possible that it just stopped rocking sometime in those 27 years between Hitchcock and Woods, and nobody wrote about it? Nobody said anything about how it stopped rocking or gave an actual date for the oxen getting tied up to the stone thing or wrote down anything? I mean, I didn't find anything about, the stone stopped rocking today. It was always either the stone doesn't rock, the stone rocks now, or the stone used to rock. Never, I rocked the stone before and now I can't rock the stone. I mean, I'm just a guy. I'm just a hobbyist. I'm not an expert or anything. So it's totally possible I missed something. But with the amount of information and primary sources I found about this stone, it's pretty surprising to me that I didn't find anything that says I rocked the stone before and it doesn't rock anymore. Also, would Woods really write about how the stone used to rock like it's a folktale if it only stopped rocking less than 30 years ago? And remember that that's just 30 years since he actually wrote about it, not 30 years since he was born in Barre, which again was 1844, cutting the time to just 14 years. So you put all this together and it's my opinion the Cradle rock probably didn't actually rock. At least by the early to mid 19th century it didn't. But again, that's just my guess if I was forced to pick an option. The reality is that I probably don't have enough information to give you a really firm answer. Besides, it's totally possible that maybe it rocked in the 1700s before the 19th century, right? But maybe not. You see, I got one last thing to tell you about. Remember at the top of the video I told you that two guys really cared about the legacy of Cradle Rock and whether it's a rocking stone or not? Well, it's actually those guys that wrote that picturesque Worcester book from 1895 that we were talking about earlier. You see, they had a lot more to say about Cradle Rock than just the small passage that I showed you. A lot more. These guys grew up around here. Cradle Rock is a part of their heritage, and they won't allow anyone to rob it of its identity. According to them, calling Cradle Rock a rocking stone is insulting Barre, Massachusetts itself. It is an attack on the legacy of these stones. And not only does Cradle Rock not rock now, it has never rocked. And suggesting otherwise is just absurd. They even explicitly make fun of the oxen pulling the stone into place legend. Like, let me just recite some of this to you. They literally start off by attacking directly by name somebody who recently said in a book that Cradle Rock rocks. I have seen in Professor Winchell's Walks and Talks in the Geologic Field one of those popular errors regarding the famous Cradle Rock, which should be corrected. Winchell says regarding rocking stones, in Barre, Massachusetts is one having a small boulder on its back, which, when in motion, suggests the idea of a child's rocking horse. This is an absurd statement. A thoroughbred rocking horse would scorn the comparison. Now, the generation which grew up under the shadow of Cradle Rock object with reason to having its name and distinction taken from it, and its personality merged in the throng of migratory boulders and rocking stones which crowd the hillsides of northern New England. If Professor Winchell's walks had actually led him to the little hill on which Cradle Rock stands, he would have seen for himself that it is not a rocking stone. There lie two enormous boulders, one upon another, the other poised lightly but firmly in its almost primeval place, from which no force, not even the traditional 14 yoke of oxen, has ever stirred it a hair's breadth. Pretty damn firm, right? Hard to argue with that. Don't you even try to lump Cradle Rock in with all those other rocking stones we talked about earlier. The majesty of this rock is not in movement, but in stability. It is an anchor here in Barre, Massachusetts. It is strong, it is stable, and it is proud to be so. Cradle Rock does not rock. Thanks for watching.